நிறைவாக தேர்ந்தெடுக்கப்பட்ட நாள் முதல் இன்று வரை இவரது செயல்பாடுகளை அறிக்கையாக ஒவ்வொரு 6 மாதங்களும் தொகுதி மக்களுக்கு வழங்குகிறார். தனது ஊக்க பேச்சுகளாலும் உத்வேக செயல்களாலும் பலருக்கு முன்மாதிரியாக முன்னோக்கி பயணித்து வரும் டாக்டர் பிடிஆர் பழனிவேல் தியாகராஜன் அவர்களை இவ்விழாவின் சிறப்பு விருந்தினராக வரவேற்பதில் பெருமிதம் கொள்கிறது YI Evolve 2022.
Thank you very much for that kind welcome. I think I've preempted our Corporation Commissioner because I see him on the agenda, but I guess we both were a bit late. So let me apologize. We were out at some bridge ground laying ceremony. But I'm happy to be here. Thank you. I think this is the second or third time I'm addressing the YI. I'm always inspired by both your entrepreneurship and your desire to make a difference beyond your own entrepreneurship for the country, for the state, for the city. Of course, it's always a pleasure to come back to Madurai and address events here. There's so many people I should acknowledge here, but most of all, our economic advisor, Dr. S. Narayan, who is with us, who has been of immense value, former Union Finance Secretary, former advisor to the Prime Minister, of great value to us. I don't have any prepared remarks, so let me maybe just speak for about 15-20 minutes and maybe I can take some questions. We are shaped by the experiences, by the opportunities, by the outcomes we get when we undertake efforts. In that sense, I've been relatively fortunate that I've had a lot of different opportunities, a lot of diversity, both in my academic education and then in my professional experience. I even say that I'm immensely grateful for having 5 years as an opposition MLA, member of the Public Accounts Committee, for my party role in establishing the party's IT wing. All of those were monumental learning experiences for me. And I could not do the job I'm doing today if I had not had those experiences. But even today, I think it's a mix. Somebody was telling me about the whole Steve Jobs view of looking backwards to connect the dots, that most of us cannot connect the dots forward, but we can always find meaning. In fact, there's a more incisive perspective on that. One of the most broad longitudinal studies of human development is a psychological study from the Harvard University called the Grant Study. And it tracked a bunch of people all the way from their late teens, early 20s at Harvard, pre-war, pre the World War, all the way to their 80s. And it progressed and tried to look at how do people, can you really predict what leads to a good life? There's so many variables that go into outcomes. Is there any kind of thing to be extracted? But one of the authors of 3 out of the 4 books that came out of that study, I think, or 2 out of the 4 books, he gives certain titles or little quotes at the beginning of each chapter. And in one of them he says, time makes liars of us all. Because when we look back, we remember things the way we want to remember things rather than what actually happened. So maybe I'm getting a bit disoriented, but I would say that it is only through failure, through attempts, through transition that you learn. And so every day for me, I think I use almost everything I ever learned or did in my life to do this job. But then I every day learn more new things that I've never contemplated before. So it's a fine balance, I think. Even at the age of 56, I still feel like I'm learning at least as much as I'm applying what I've learned. I'd just make 2 corrections on this introductory video. In fact, we reduced the revenue deficit by 16,000 crores, not 7,000 crores. And that is after spending about 20,000 crores more than my predecessor, my friend Mr. OPS, had projected in February before the elections. That means we've done something like a 36,000 crore turnaround. In fact, I'll go one step further and say at that time he had not projected that the revenues would be impacted by second lockdown and third lockdown. So we lost another 8,000 crores of revenue. That means if I add the 20 plus 16 plus 8, our performance was actually 44,000 crores better than had been projected in February. That's a remarkable outcome. In my wildest dreams, I didn't think we'd get there. But I would say, without my chief minister, none of that would have been possible. At the end of the day, in the design of democracy and more in the practice of it, we have ended up in almost authoritarian designs. The role of the legislature, the role of individual ministers and all that is constrained by the cult of leadership that has evolved, partially legally or constitutionally because of anti-defection and so forth, partially by practice and by ever more kind of authoritarian leaders, especially in other parties, maybe not mine so much. So without my chief minister, I could not effect the slightest change. Second, I would say without the brilliant advice of people like Dr. Narayan, and I'm going to give an exact example in a minute, we could not truly effectuate the vision we say we have, which is a more equitable society, social justice, inclusion, progress for all. These are very, very, very hard things to implement. I'll come back to that also in a minute. Third, one man or one minister, even one finance secretary, only can set the tone, be a guide, help mentor, train, etc. At the end of the day, you have to make the system work properly. Of course, you can use better technology, better built-in controls, but you have to develop human talent. And really, that is the mission of most leadership, is to develop the talent around them. As it is in entrepreneurship or your companies, it is the same, I think, in government. So I've been blessed with many wonderful supporters, from advisors to IAS officers to other department staff to PSU heads and so forth, but most of all my chief minister. Now let me go back to what I was saying. If you really have an ambition that you want to do social justice, you want to do inclusion, you want to do opportunity for all, the greatest barrier you have is that the system is designed to not allow that to happen. Every time you try to bring change, every time you try to make things more equitable, the vested interests have 100 weapons in their hand to thwart your initiatives. And the vested interests are very powerful. By the definition of vested interests, they have already vested into the current system and are extraordinarily benefiting from it. So were I to try and bring in some new reform, some new scheme, some new approach, it is very, very difficult because you have to overcome the vested interests first. In fact, the vested interests have infinite and immediate access to the ears of all those who make decisions. Whether it's politicians, whether it's the press, whether it's the paid press or the aligned press or the neutral press. There's all kinds of press. And it is, in the nature of communications that you first have to fight. So I would say a crucial thing that I've learned in government is those who control the narrative kind of control the agenda, right? And even if I have a good agenda, if others control the narrative, we're not able to execute it. I think it's a difficult lesson to learn. It's even harder to execute, but we're working towards that. The vested interests, those who benefit unfairly from the system, have access every single day to every level of decision making. The really left out don't have any access to anything. I'll give you a very simple example of how the most affected are left out. We did a survey along with one of our partners, JPAL, from the MIT lab, about aged people living alone. And it was startling. In Tamil Nadu, it shows something like 20% of aged women live alone. That's a big number. We also have a rapidly aging population. But within those, the government has a scheme called the OAP, Old Age Pension, where we're supposed to supply, not a big amount, but 1,000 rupees a month. If we look at who is able to access it and not, there's some people who shouldn't get it who get it, but that doesn't really worry me. What worries me a lot is, of those who don't get it, the bulk of them are the really, really underprivileged who don't have anybody. They live alone. They don't have access to technology. They don't know how to do an online or a mobile app. They don't know how to transport themselves to a government office. And therefore, they are not able to benefit from the scheme that was intended most of all to benefit them rather than other people. So the government has to find ways, if we really want to achieve our ambition and put our money where our mouth is, we have to find ways to reach those who are otherwise unreachable, who are otherwise without access. And it's very hard to do. But I don't want to talk all bleak things. So let me just wrap up with 2 or 3 really good examples. At the behest of our advisors, who from the first meeting we started, they started telling us about the implications of learning loss because of the COVID lockdown. And so I would venture to say, before any other state, and certainly even most countries, the government of Tamil Nadu, in our first budget in August 2021, announced a remedial program. I can definitely say driven almost 100% by our economic advisors. A remedial education program, which we later named Illam Thedi Kalvi, and many people, starting with the Chief Secretary, Education Department, CM Secretaries, everybody had input into the design of the program. But we designed the program with volunteers from each village, each block, each community, running a couple of hours after school for government school students to have a place to come and just get together, reculturalize into the notion of collective learning. This we did because it lines up with our interest of social justice and supporting access and supporting everybody. I was spectacularly happy with the early results. I insisted that Madurai should be one of the pilot districts. I went and monitored how it was working. More and more people gave us input. We perfected the design. I'm not saying it's great now, but it's better than anything I've ever seen in that we have done. And we rolled it out earlier this year. Now, by great good fortune, we had a data set because of this MOU between Government of Tamil Nadu and JPAL. We had a data set of about 20,000 students who had been sampled in 2019 for their reading, Tamil, English, math levels. And so we were able to sample those same students again, once when the school started, once when the schools were 6 months in, and once most recently. So you had all these data points. What was the original learning? What was the extent of the loss? What was the recovery after school started and before Illam Thedi Kalvi, which is our program? And then what is the extent of the learning now? And these results were so good and so unique because very few people had such a big data set that they've already been published in scientific journals and published, took place in the UN General Assembly's Education Conference and the COVID recovery sessions. And what it shows is that in the lockdown, the average student fell 2 years behind. That means an 8-year-old at the end of lockdown was reading and doing math at the level of a 6-year-old before lockdown. Effectively, the 2 years was completely lost. Of course, it showed huge variation. The poorer the family of the student, the less educated the mother of the student, the greater the loss they had. But what was surprising is that coming back to school within a few months already moved them up about 50% of the loss. And the amazing thing is those children who opted to enroll or their parents enrolled them, meaning they sent them regularly to Illam Thedi Kalvi sessions. About 60-65% of the eligible people attended these. It varied in the rurals. It was as high as 90%. And those who came at least 4 days a week. That was remarkable, first of all, that they found it that useful. But those students showed an additional 18% recovery going back towards their pre-COVID levels. In effect, about a quarter of the overall or 30% of the overall recovery came from doing this simple 1.5 to 2 hours a day at the end of school. Now, if you've lived in rich countries, you know that in all poor neighborhoods, they do things like after-school programs to keep the kids off the street against violence and drugs and things like that. I'm not even talking about all that. I'm talking about simply being able to do what is 34 plus 29? What is 17 times 3? Can you read this passage in Tamil? Those kinds of things. And what was even more remarkable is that the lower the education of the mother and the poorer the children, the greater the value of the after-school program. So we really have achieved what we say our ambition is, which is we have provided social justice so that the poorest, weakest get the greatest uplift because of the money we spend. And all of this comes with the spending of a few hundred crores or 2% of the overall school education budget. If there's one program I've ever been associated with in my whole life that I'm very happy and proud about, is this program, because we put so little money and got such great outcomes. Right? But this is the level of work that you have to do to achieve your ambitions. And unlike in the corporate world, just because everybody is aligned one way, the profit of the company makes everybody better off, especially if you have stock options and whatnot. The competition of the market forces change. Unlike those things, in the government, there's neither a natural driver of change, nor is there any organizational concept of a carrot or a stick or incentives or discipline or anything. I recently, through my department, we put out a GO convening a human resources reforms advisory committee. In the committee, in that GO, there were many errors, but that's okay. One of the words in there said assessment. The unions went to war. They don't think it should be allowed that government servants should have assessment. Right? This is the environment in which we operate. So, if we achieve anything at all in government, you must assume that we are superhuman beings. There's no natural, variable that drives good outcomes. I would also say that our breakfast program, we have innovated a lot compared to the design of the lunch program. In the lunch program, about 70% of the total costs go to payroll, and about 30% go to food and energy and transportation and everything else. In the breakfast program, it's a completely different ratio, because in the rural areas, we do it as block grants, and the parents of the children form self-help groups and get the money, buy the resources, and cook and feed their own children. The ratio is much better, the outcomes are much better. Same way in the urban areas, we use Internet of Things, we use automated cooking scale with guarantees quality, hygiene, etc., and helps our Tamil Nadu startups that were already in this space. So every program, every step, every rupee spent, that is our main kind of barrier. Is this money achieving what we said our ambition was: social justice, inclusion, and opportunity for all? Is it bringing structural reform that will ensure that these benefits continue irrespective of whether I'm in the seat or we are in government? And how do we ensure that forces that are outside of our control, for example, union government initiatives or new constraints, don't derail what it is that we want to do? So I would say I had relatively high jobs. I was global head of offshore markets for Lehman Brothers. I was global head of money markets, e-commerce, foreign exchange from commercial banking for Stanchart. I would say relative to those jobs, this job I'm doing is 100 times harder than that. Not in the volume of money, not in the complexity of operations, but in the actual execution against all the forces arraigned against good outcomes. Then this is the hardest job I've done. So I wanted to only speak for about 15 minutes. I've spoken for almost 20. Let me stop here and maybe take a couple of questions. Oh, sorry. The other correction I wanted to make, we left out our 5th economic advisor, Professor Jean Reyes from Raipur University, I think. Where is he? From somewhere in Jharkhand. Yeah. We have a 5th economic advisor that was not on there, who adds also a lot to our discussion.
You spoke about Illam Thedi Kalvi and factors about that. I mean, there is a huge, gap in the learning and development between the rural and the urban sectors of our state. So, what can the government do to, bridge the gap, sir?
I got to be very careful. I'll just say 2-3 things that should show you that I share your concern. Not only is there a gap between urban and rural, the overall levels of learning are not at all what would let you sleep well at night. I haven't told you what it was before COVID. I told you it deteriorated 2 years. It was quite bad to start with. So there are some real issues in the education department. We spend, as an MLA in the assembly pointed out, so I'm only quoting him, this is not me. As he pointed out in the assembly, Government of Tamil Nadu spends about 300 or 400 rupees less per child in school education than the Kendriya Vidyalayas. And his question was, are we achieving outcomes anywhere near what the Kendriya Vidyalayas achieve? I'll let you answer that yourself. That's why I'm saying there is a need for profound structural reform. The system is broken. I can't say it more plainly than that. The system is hijacked by vested interests in every way, in every department. And without reform, you cannot get, we went 7 or 8 years in a row. Every year, new record revenue deficit, new record fiscal deficit, and growth which used to be 10.15% real growth between 2006 to 11 in the DMK regime, including the period of the global financial crisis, slipped first to 7.8 or 7.9, and then to 7.1, and then in COVID to something like 5 point something, and then the last year 1 point something. Leave the COVID out. You have a system that is failing. It needs reform. Without you can't expect better outcomes just because you have better faces, right? You actually have to reform the process. Without reforming the process, you cannot get different outcomes. And I'll just say, in my understanding, it's not my department, I don't want to get in trouble. In my understanding, there's profound reform required in the education sector. I think we have 5 minutes if you want to ask some questions.
Right.
Very good morning, sir. I have a very Madurai-specific question. What does Madurai lack positioning itself as an economic powerhouse compared to Chennai and Coimbatore of late? And is there any update on the IT park that has been announced?
Yeah, the IT parks are on track. In fact, there's more than been announced. I don't want to overstep my bounds again. We're talking to many large companies that are happy to come, each set up few thousand jobs. So we have the talent. COVID showed us how many people are actually from around this area that would like to work here. We have some data because of the pass system that was required. I think that will be the relatively easy fix. What is really lacking for us is probably number one, infrastructure, right? Our infrastructure is profoundly poorer than Chennai. So we are in the middle of some discussions. I didn't want to be accused of parochial bias the first year I was finance minister. So we have so far stayed relatively neutral, but CM is very supportive. So we'll have to bring some really structural improvements to our infrastructure. It's in process. We'll do that. I think it's also a more cosmopolitan and kind of welcoming ecosystem, cultural ecosystem. I think that's the slightly harder part, but we're working on that also. We're working on urban beautification, some new models. Commissioners here, he can add some of the projects we're looking at. So, but you know, things don't change overnight. My ambition is that the jobs are much easier to get because we can create an opportunity. There are big companies that will come, set up, and they can execute a lot faster if we give them the land and remove the red tape. And we're certainly doing that. But if you create enough of an ecosystem, then it starts building on itself. And I would say we have a couple of major steps that the government has to take in terms of infrastructure and some deregulation and some stuff. We're looking at that.
One question on a lighter note. We've been digging deeper into numbers and how the things are functioning. We all are entrepreneurs and we take care of one business or two or maybe a conglomerate, and we say like we are busy all the time going through everything, and work-life balance becomes a big question. With you being surrounded with so many people and you're almost kind of an umbrella for every other business that's happening here, we are really looking up to you to see like how you really balance your work life.
Please like don't. I'm the worst example of work-life balance. Please don't look up to me. I have serious ambition. Every year I tell myself this is the year that I'm going to improve. I'm going to go to the gym regularly and spend time with my family. So I don't know. I don't want to say more than that. I'd say don't be better than me. Always look to be better than me. Don't be like me. I'm not that great.
Thank you for all the reformations, what you are doing for the finance minister in Tamil Nadu. And also like for all the TV shows, like that's how we become a fan of you. And we are seeing like, you know, politicians become hero after a long time. In my lifetime, I am seeing for the first time. So thank you, continue to do that, sir. And my question is, so what about the global recessions and what about the global crisis, right? So how it is going to impact Tamil Nadu and also India for the next couple of years.
Yeah.
We had COVID and now the global crisis.
I'll run out of time. I got it. 1 second. I've said it in the assembly, I'll say it again. Of course, the odds of a global recession are quite high because there's no history in the world of this much easing of monetary policy, trillions of dollars of excess liquidity, followed by this much fiscal stimulus, trillions of dollars of fiscal stimulus, and having a soft landing after that. That's why we're seeing inflation not seen in 30, 40, 50 years. So I would say the odds of a global recession are significantly higher now than they've been any time in the last 15 years, maybe 25, 30 years. I have just said in the assembly that were a global recession to come, then Tamil Nadu is better positioned than most in multiple ways. What we can do as the government, we have both excess liquidity in the right places, I won't say where. We have rolled over borrowing capacity under the 15th Finance Commission that we'll continue to roll over and keep. Because should a recession hit, at least interest rates will go down a lot and we can borrow unless there's stagflation. In that case, we have some assets and so forth. So we are positioned to deal with the global dramatic downturn better than most. And I suspect India will do a little better than the global average, but I guarantee you that Tamil Nadu will do better than anybody else. Okay. Thank you.